Okay, thanks everybody. This is this webinar. There's so much to talk about in stocking strategies. Ironically, I was looking forward probably this one to the most, and I've had the most difficulty trying to come up with the slides to discuss this because you could talk about this for days. At the same time, you don't want to go into too much detail. So let me just quickly get through the purpose of the series. For those that have attended. Have a sip of coffee for those that you haven't. Really, the series has helped to. It's the purpose to get people to understand MRO and try to lift the focus on them. You know, they're a high percentage of cost and spend in these materials and the effort, and there's a lot of value to be found by managing these materials better. So the objective is on the along and aligned with the purpose is to help companies utilize the data that drives efficiency. And of course, one of those is a huge piece of that is stocking strategies. So the series that we've covered so far over the last few months is we started off with the cataloging, and then we quickly went into standardization of your catalog. I'm gonna touch again on the free text spend that we talked about last month because that's as I call it the evil twin of cataloging. We'll talk today about stocking strategies, and next month we're gonna talk about the procurement strategies and procurement master data, which I think is heavily missed, and it's a source of massive opportunity for automation and employee efficiency. So let's get into it. So I found this little saying which I thought was funny because obviously I cut and paste MRO on top of I think life, but this was such a relevant saying. It was quite funny. So MRO is a balance of, and you think of this from a maintenance person or a fitter, if they say in Australia. MRO is a balance of holding on and letting go, and it makes me think straight away of squirrel stores and stocks people have hidden all over the place because you know, in the maintenance and engineering world, you know, their job is to keep plants operating so we can make the revenue that they're designed to do. And you can imagine what that leads to a lot of excess inventory or letting go of squirrel stores and holding on to things, which actually, ironically, can drive inefficiencies into the business. So from a stocking strategy, we're going to look at this from a high level view. Let's look at it from two things. First, let's talk about risk. One of the key purposes of having spare parts is to reduce risk to the business. Because the purpose of the business, let's talk maybe if it's oil and gas or chemicals, is keep the plant running. And to do that, you have to have spare parts. Things wear out, things are going to break, things are going to go boom. So therefore, you need parts to get things going again. And if you don't manage that carefully, well, you get out of control. Materials, you get way too many materials tied up in the MRO space, and then it becomes a huge area of waste, which makes things actually, ironically, can make things more difficult in the business and more time consuming for people to get the materials that they need. So as I mentioned, plant availability, that's or OEE, overall equipment efficiency, is a metric around that space. You start looking, and you know the $10 million question is how critical is a part? Defining criticality always will be difficult in that. I'm not going to delve into how you define criticality in this space, but that is something that is frequently talked about. And if it's something that you're keen to learn more about, we can discuss that because that is a hot topic always wherever you go in the MRO space. And some of the subsets of that are when you look at the plant or a piece of plant, you look at, well, what's the frequency of failure that this piece of gear is experiencing? And what's the impact of that failure? You know, is it something that immediately stops other parts of the plant, so it's more critical, or does it? You've got fail safes and it's okay. You got redundancy built in, so you can have workarounds. Risk is over for MRO is lead time. Lead time is something supply chain teams haven't really looked at as close as they should, but it's a critical factor, especially in our COVID world, where supply chains now are being massively impacted in terms of it's taking much, much longer to get things than you used to. And that completely impacts on reorder points and how reactive are you to that? And sometimes you don't know the lead time has changed until you go to procure it again. And generally that's too late. So then the next thing I'll talk about is how much is your business in the probably more in the maintenance engineering side of the business, is it planned versus unplanned? That has a massive impact in terms of what you need to hold and why you need to hold it. Okay, so on the opposite side is obviously cost. You can't have everything. That's just, it'd be too inefficient and it would cost the business too much. So this side, we look at, well, what's the cost of the working capital? And I think we may have talked about that before. So your holding cost or your carrying cost, if you don't know what it is for your business, if you haven't calculated it with your accountants, just use 25%. So 25% per annum is what it costs you to carry and hold spare parts. And there's two components. That one is the cost of cash, which is called the WAC rate, the weighted average cost of capital, and that's usually 7 to 10%. And then on the other side is everything else, which is a lot of these things below, which is what's your obsolescence, what's your pilferage, damage, electricity, infrastructure, buildings, labor, is everything else. And so that, if you don't know, just use 25%. And then all these other things, if you're storing everything, well, then your storage costs are going to go up. You know, do you even have preservation activities included in your warehouses to maintain gearboxes and motors and turning the shafts on all your motors every season, things like that. So, okay, so this is, think of it as a balance. Like this is the little picture in the middle is the fulcrum on the scale. You're trying to balance the risk versus the cost to manage it. Okay, so that kind of sets the scene in terms of you can't have everything, but you need a lot of things. And usually when you look closely, you find there's a lot of materials you're not stocking enough of, and there's a lot of materials you're stocking too much of. So the strategy is obviously trying to address that. So if we build this into a bit of a matrix, it helps, you know, everything that we do is around segmentation. All the materials that you have cataloged, you have to build a bit of a segmentation. Segment them so you can understand them and manage them based on that segment. And a simple way to look at it this way is just putting that risk and cost into a simple matrix. And then we think first from the demand side. So everything comes from demand and supply. So engineering or the maintenance departments, depending on the business that you're in, the demand signal for the spare parts is based on a risk reduction. So the engineers in the plant are trying to reduce risk, and that can come in many different things. One of the first mitigation strategies to reduce risk is to just carry a spare part, because that's probably the lowest cost option compared to building redundancy into the plant so that you can bypass it when you have a breakdown, which can be very, very expensive. So it's much more simple, just carry a spare part. And that's very, very valid. We'll talk about this a little bit more in the matrix. Then the opposite side is the supply side. So again, we're trying to balance the demand with supply. And obviously the procurement team, their job is to reduce the cost of the goods that are required for the engineering team to keep the plant running. So, and we're going to talk about free text and how that cost is increased when materials are purchased through free text versus cataloged, and enabling the procurement team to negotiate. So if we look at that, so the procurement team is trying to move things from the right side over to the left side. And that can either be through lead time reduction. For example, you're buying motors that are only manufactured in Europe. Well, can you negotiate with your vendor to get them stocked, at least in the country, to significantly reduce your lead time? Doing that enables you to reduce your reorder point. So straight away, cost reduction. What materials are placed on contracts for purchasing automation and cost control? In North America, you have a lot more vendor managed inventory versus in Australia, where things are much more remote. That's too difficult because vendors can't get to the plants. Some plants, you can only fly to because the roads get washed out so often. So VMI is not as efficient in Australia versus North America, which is very prevalent. And then you look at things of consignment stock, and then the cost associated with that, which can be very handy. So you have the materials, but not the value, but that does come at a cost as well. So it's just balancing that. So if we look at these these boxes in my little matrix on the right, the first thing you're going to focus on, obviously, is your high cost, high risk, high cost materials. And these generally you think about are probably going to be your rotables or your repairables and your big pumps, your motors, compressors, things that are really, really critical to keep your plant running. And so, and that's a whole nother topic we can talk about is a repairables process and how you manage that in your plant, because that is very, very important. And how you do, what are your strategies around these materials? For example, I used to work in a chemicals plant where we had a jet engine that actually ran the compression for the plant. And so clearly this jet engine literally was a 737 Rolls-Royce jet engine that ran the compression, and we had 3 of them, but one was only ever in the plant. The other 2 were spares that were always kept available in case the plant went down. So when the one operating came out, it came out still in operating condition. We never ran it to failure, pulled it out, put the next one in, ran it up for a set number of hours in case you had any infancy failure. And that was generally a couple of months. And then you would, only then when the plant's up and running in a controlled state, then you would send that one away for repair. And then we had a 3rd one because of the criticality of this jet engine. So a truly, truly critical spare. Truly critical spares, you should never, ever be out of stock. So you have definitely important materials, but when you define criticality, you really need to think, what does that mean to your stock levels and your holding and the cost impact? Because if you're down, if they don't have that jet engine, that plant was going to be down for months, and that is not a sustainable cost. So therefore, it's worth it to hold more. Next, if we go on to the next one, we've got materials that are high risk but low cost. So if we think about these from an MRO perspective, the box that we were just in is the R's, the repairables, and then this is more the M's. So most of your spare parts will fall in here. And when I say low cost, that's very relative. In mining, low cost is $50,000 versus other businesses, low cost is less than $1,000. So think of that relative to your business, and how you manage those materials. So if you don't have a valve that operates a chemical line of hydrochloric acid, well, that's going to be pretty important. So the risk is high, but the valve actually may not cost but $1,000. So therefore, you need to understand the risk involved and stock appropriately, which we'll talk more about in a few minutes. Next, we go down to the bottom right, and you think low risk, but high cost. And the first thing I think about, these are the O's. So you get a lot of the O's in here, the operating supplies. So again, catalysts for like a chemicals plant, lubricants, oils, greases, fuels, high spend. If you're in mining, this is massive spend, some of your highest spend, but the risk is quite low because it's readily available. Service kits is another one. So these are things you can think about as you're constantly focused on how can I reduce the cost, because the repetitive nature of the material is important. Water treatment chemicals, things like that. Okay, and then assigning the correct strategy for those materials and how you manage them. Next. The last one is your low risk, low cost. So these are nuts and bolts, PPE, things you need to have, but it's not going to stop a plant. But again, a lot more of the O's are in this space. And then this is where you look at vendor managed inventory, consignment stocks, things that are less important to the business. You want to purchase in bulk. You don't want to buy these every week or every month. These are things that you want to buy at once, be smart about it, and make them available to the business so that they can be consumed at will. So this is a different approach to think about it from a demand and supply, and putting the risk versus the cost into a bit of a matrix to help you understand how am I going to break these materials down. And again, I could talk about this. I've done this on many different levels and from a segmentation with some of my coworkers in the past, and we've got into intimate detail on this. So, and then from a different perspective, one of the key things you need to understand, and this is from the demand signal, is how consistent is that signal? Are you always getting planned requirements, or are they generally unplanned? And now there's all shapes and sizes of business are in this space. And there's obviously, most businesses have a big mix. If you've got really good maintenance strategies in place, you're going to have more planned demand coming in, but you also have breakdown, which turns into your unplanned. So when I say unplanned, that could be spare parts being issued out today for consumption today. So it wasn't planned. You have it, they need it, you issued it, but that's unplanned. Versus planned is, the quantity of materials that are going to be issued to work orders next week or the next 4 weeks, and you can plan appropriately to get them kitted and ready and issued to the maintenance orders and to the maintenance staff where and when required. So that makes a big, big difference. If you have planned demand, that's great. You can buy materials as they're required. So every maintenance guy is going to want to have, or gal is going to want to have brand new parts for their job. So if you're working in a planned environment, this enables you to buy materials as required. Technically, you should only stock in the warehouse to cover unplanned demand because it's unplanned. So you have to have it at an arm's length. So think about that perspective. For those of you that use SAP, if you think about it, we used to start calculating, well, I only want to look at the consumption from unplanned demand because that's what I need to stock for. If it was consumed in a planned manner, I don't want to calculate that into my reorder points because I can buy that when it's needed, as long as it's past the lead time. And a lot of companies haven't gone to that level of maturity, but that's where you want to get to if you want to really start reducing your cost and you really start driving the planning. It's safer and it's far more cost effective. And then you just keep the stocks on the shelf for when you have breakdowns. And then obviously in the unplanned environment, some people that is their strategy. They run to failure. There is no planning because they're in an area where they don't have really significantly critical materials. The equipment's easy to maintain. So we're just going to run it to failure, fix it as required. We've got people available to do it at a moment's notice. Heavy industry, generally not so much because of the size of the materials. So you need a much more planned environment. And therefore, an unplanned environment is more costly because you're going to carry more materials. It means warehousing staff, warehouses, capability in that space, MHE, all these different things. And sadly, usually for unplanned demand, you have a higher percentage of free text materials. And that's one thing I'll talk about in a minute. Okay, the evil twin. So I harped on this last month is if you want to get control of your MRO materials and enable reorder points and all of this, so you've got good control of the spend in the indirect material space, you have to have some type of control over your free text spend, because every single site, every single business I've been in, if you allow the business to buy materials free text without control, they will. So meaning that I've seen it before where mechanics know that there's a motor in the warehouse. It's been there a couple of years. It's not too confident on the preservation activities that are happening. So I'm just going to go buy a new one. And they can, and they do. And if you think about the impacts of that, so now we've got this motor sitting on the shelf for 4 years. Now it's going to probably sit there for 6 years or even 8 years. So it looks like we don't use this motor. So should we get rid of it? You talk to the maintenance guys and they say, no, we use those motors once a year. And say, no, you don't. This thing never moves. We buy it free text and consume that. That one's for emergency. That's a bad place to be, because now you've lost control of your spare parts, and it's almost a redundant exercise. So controlling your free text spend is really important. So because of my experience, when I came along to Prospect and MDO, I said, guys, we've got to give this business ability to be able to catalog a material very, very, very quickly when the need occurs, not after, because they know it takes too long. I can't be bothered cataloging. It's just too hard. So I don't. So we started building into MDO the ability to use the punch out functionality with, this is a lot of SAP speak. So if you're not in SAP, I apologize. But you punch out into MDO, you use the standardized methodology to create a material. Let's say it's a bearing ball, you put in the attributes, create the material immediately. It'll do a duplicate check first to make sure that the material already doesn't exist. If it does, great, you just use that material. If not, it'll create the material number for you immediately, pull it into the work order, and then you can track and trace that material. You've got accurate material groups, all your spend analysis, all your data that goes into procurement is now correct, and you enhance the material at a later stage. So what I've done here, I started looking at free tech spend versus the efforts to use material numbers, and it was 3 to 1 basically. So if you think it takes 3 times as long than it does to use material numbers. And I had so many arguments in the mining industry with some people around, why do you guys do this? You just seem to want to do free text. And it was simply because change. They had gotten so used to putting all the information in the work order, the material groups, the purchasing groups, typing in this, getting a quote from the vendor, putting in the vendor part number, attaching the quote to the work order, getting the work order released. It became almost, they didn't have to think about it. It just happened quickly, even though it was much, much harder. So we had to break a lot of paradigms down and just keep on coaching and showing these guys the benefits of doing it and how it took a third less time. So all you need to know is the material number. And if it's in a BOM, that's quick, quantity, and the date to the work order. And after time, they realized it was far, far quicker. Once they did this, we ended up stocking far more materials because now we could see the demand. So really, really important is think about the free tech spend, and you need to understand, well, what percentage of your spend for indirect materials is on free text. Okay, so this is, again, I'll try to talk on both SAP speak and not. So some considerations, and again, this one slide here, we could probably talk for hours on. A couple of my team and I, we've done this at length. We've had many, many, many conversations going through and understanding the different things we've seen around the world with people just setting a safety stock. All they do is say, I'll put safety stock at 2, and that's all. That's as far as they go. Versus reorder points or minimums, and reorder quantities versus maximums. Understanding your lead times, and then what formulas do I use to even calculate a reorder point, or do I not bother and just ask the maintenance guys what they want? It's fraught with danger at every turn, so it's the strategy should help define that. And as you start this journey, you're quickly going to come up against a lot of questions in that space. On SAP side, I kind of put in the main material types and the lot sizes that are in SAP that you can use. I've seen a lot of people configure the hell out of this space, and I don't think you need to. Usually they're configuring it because of lack of understanding of how it should work. Personally, I prefer the V1EX, which is your reorder point and reorder quantity. I've run into a lot of businesses that do min and max. Maximum to me is really irrelevant for spare parts. Why are you saying I'm going to stock to a maximum of 5? What if the fitter or the mechanic wants 10? Maximum is irrelevant. So you may carry 2, and if he wants 10 because he's going to do a campaign on replacing bearings, well, of course you're going to buy 10. So the maximum really doesn't make a lot of sense. It's more about when to reorder, that's your reorder point, or your minimum, same thing. And then how much do I reorder? And that's based on, is there a work order, or is there a reorder quantity, a rounding value, or what is the vendor supply? So again, we could talk about that in quite a bit of length, just in understanding ROP and ROQ versus min-max. It's not that big of a deal, but it can have some cash implications. In SAP, V1 means it's looking at your reorder point plus external requirements, and VB is like a horse with 2 blinders on. It's only looking at the stock on hand. And then how do you include safety stock? So when you start looking at your calculation for your reorder points, one thing that comes up is, oh, well, I need to include a portion of safety stock. And that can be based on vendor variability, demand variability, both. And how do I include that? Or do I use that separately, or do I include it into my reorder point? So food for thought. If you have any questions on that, or that you want to talk about that separately here, please send them through, because we could talk about that for a while. And all the little words down in the left, those are there are many websites you can go find to understand how do I establish something if I don't have an inventory management tool. How do I define a reorder point? Okay, so your min and max down there. There's some things to look at. So enter the world of the internet and Google it, and you're going to find heaps. And that was just one that I found that I thought I'd include for you to get you started. Let me do a check on time. We're getting pretty close to the end, so it goes fast, 30 minutes. MRP management. So this is something that I've seen. Oh man, a lot of people don't understand MRP, and then the way it's operated can be frustrating. So I have a lot of people that turn on MRP from a production standpoint. And they say, "Oh, we run it weekly. That's enough. You guys don't need to worry about it." Well, not really. Not for maintenance. I think MRP, when it was first designed, used to run over the weekends because it took so long because of computing power. It took a long time, especially if you think like automotive industry. It took a long time to calculate multi-level bombs, where these days computing power is far quicker. So I in the mining industry, we would run MRP on an hourly basis because it was single level, very simple. It's basically turning demand into supply, automate the PO, sight unseen, keep it simple. And again, that depends on your business. A lot of companies just run it daily and then you react daily. But if you have breakdowns, you can run into issues where you're waiting for a requisition, and that can frustrate the guys that are using material numbers. They say, "I've used the material number you told me, but I had to wait a whole day to get my requisition." So again, if you run it hourly on average, or even half hourly, if you run it hourly, the MRP run will take minutes. So food for thought. It's a simple program to run. You can run it very quickly. And then that drives back, as I mentioned, to your purchasing space. And again, I've gone into this because of data. If you set up your data well, you can significantly increase your purchasing processes and turn it into negotiating rates to automate the POs. In the SAP space, I don't understand why so many companies have purchasing officers creating POs. SAP can do that very simply. Put in the data, information records, outline agreements, source lists. Let SAP create your POs for you. I'd rather have a purchasing officer negotiating a rate for a pump than just converting a pump quote into a purchase order. Where are you going to get more value? 9 times out of 10, if you ask for a discount, you will get it. And the last one, which is near and dear to my heart, is exception messages. I often find many companies, they say they don't have time to manage the exceptions. And that results in a lot of noise within the business. And again, that's probably a whole nother session in itself, is how do you manage the MRP exception messages? So that's basically balancing the demand and supply. The messages tell you when that balance is out of whack. So you get demand that can't be supplied and supply that has no demand. Okay, and that's if you're an SAP business, transaction is MD06, which is your MRP list, and then you can use MD07, MD05, and then of course my favorite MD04, the stock requirements list, to manage all those exceptions. So some of the metrics. So obviously, when you're going to start doing this, you need to think about, well, how am I going to manage my performance? I need to understand where I am. So again, some of the metrics that I've already talked about is, well, what is your free text percentage? It's very important to understand that. One business we're working right now, it's over 80%. So they've now got a program in place to really drive that down aggressively by Christmas. And that's fantastic, because they'll get there and they're going to see a massive change on their working capital. It's going to be hard. It's going to be some change management that's going to be driven into the people. This is across North America. Your planned versus unplanned demand. There's many ways to do that. You can do it based on the date of the requirement of the material versus the date issue, or the work order types. If you've got, again, in SAP, you've got PMO 1s, 2s, 3s, 4s, 6s. You can have different number ranges for those, and that can help you segment that your planned versus unplanned demand. And then how do you calculate your order points with each? The key one for inventory is always stock turns. I think it's a very high level. A lot of people are ironically don't understand it, which is interesting. So a lot of people turn that into stock days. Very similar. It's just taking it and divided by 365 gives you the number of days of inventory that you have to make it a little more tangible. A lot of people talk about stockouts. In MRO, stockouts, yes, they're important, but you'll have a lot of materials that are stocked out, which is okay because you're going to stock one. It gets consumed and it gets replenished. So that's why I say stockouts with requirements. So a stockout that has no requirement is fine. You consume it because you use it every 3 months, but the lead time is only 10 days. That's not a bad thing. But if you do have a requirement waiting for that material, that's another thing. So stockouts with requirements. And again, around segmentation, I talked before, is looking at, well, you've got your active material and your inactive material. And that can be typically we time bound. In the mining industry and chemicals, we looked at active was less than 2 years use. So if we used it within the last 2 years, we considered it active. If it wasn't used in 2 years or more, you consider it inactive. And then you start addressing those materials from obsolescence perspective. Are they obsolete? Do we still need them? Are they critical? And then also from a little bit of a different perspective is surplus. You buy things that get returned, you can end up with a lot of surplus inventory that can be extremely costly. So we're looking at how do you manage that quickly and effectively to potentially return to vendors, doing stock transfers to other plants or other parts of the world where you have businesses operating. Because again, 25% per annum is pretty expensive if you start holding materials that you're not consuming. So again, these are some things, these are just a few metrics that we've put in place in many different places to help you understand how effective is your stocking strategy. So it's understanding, you want to balance risk with your cost, but then your metrics should start driving it. And you really need to turn this into a finance discussion because MRO can be a very, very large portion of your working capital in a business. A business that was associated with mining, almost all your inventory is actually spare parts because the material that may be mining flows through the business so quickly, they've got very small stockpiles. So therefore your indirect materials are everything. That's where all your working capital is versus manufacturing. It can be different. But and again, any dollar saved on your indirect materials goes right to the bottom line. So that's why it's very important to manage this cost. And in the COVID world, it's creating a bit of a challenge, especially when you can't get materials, shutdowns or turnarounds. If you can't get people, it's very important to keep people on the tools. So that wraps up. I went over by about 5 minutes. So what we want to do is, if you have any questions, please start firing them in because this is a pretty broad topic. And it's hard to really target the things that you want to know. So that's why I'm keen to see if there's any questions that you may have. Please enter them now. If not, if you come think of something later, please send them through to us. The email at themarketing@perspective.com. We're going to start doing another round of not so much of a webinar, but we're going to start doing small, probably informative videos around really targeted pieces of information on a lot of the things that we've seen through the companies that we're implementing our tool with around data and processes. There's a lot of things that we can help with, but once you start controlling the data, it really enables your tool, especially we work closely with a lot of SAP companies or companies that use SAP. And so we get a lot of experience in terms of what we've seen of people using SAP far more effective when they have very effective data and very controlled data. It really frees up time, removes noise. With that being said, let's see if there are any, do you have any questions? Please type them in the question box. If not, we'll leave that for a few minutes. And if you have no questions, then we can finish early. There are no questions coming through that I have right now, so I'll wait a second here and see if anybody has anything they want to talk about on the demand signal or risk or costs. Return on investment. So we've started building into our tool an ROI calculator, because this is one thing it's a difficult space to get the business to commit time and money to, because it's kind of, nobody really cares about spare parts. That happens all the time. I hear that constantly. I want to focus on maintenance and production efforts and new equipment or things like that. And so having a calculator to help people say, well, what's the return on investment if I invested money in a project for spare parts? What is my rate of return? So we're starting to do that and help people. Okay, so we've got a question to come through. It says, do you have any cataloging tool for data? Absolutely. That's exactly what MDO does. So the MDO tool is a cataloging tool. So if you get time, just go to our website at either perspective.com, the website there, or masterdataonline.com, and you'll see what we do is we build your taxonomy, or we help you build a taxonomy into MDO. So for example, as I mentioned before, when you could catalog on the fly from the work order, you go into MDO and you say, well, what do you need? I need a bearing. Okay. The next question asks, what type of bearing, which is your modifier? Is it a ball bearing? And then, there's about a dozen different types of bearings. You select that. That automatically applies the UNSPSC code and your material group. So those first questions have already applied a mapping table to help answer things that you typically would do on a free text order. And then you start filling out the attributes that you need for that material. It gets created immediately or enhanced. And what we do with MDO, we create a HERS record. If you've got a manufacturing part number, a HERS record links an SAP material number to a manufacturing number. So it helps searching. In our tool, we give you really good search capabilities. So if all you have is a part number, it'll link you back to your SAP material number. Next thing is all your purchasing information. We can create info records and source lists automatically from the information entered into the request. And also on the demand side, we can automatically place materials into bills of materials, equipment bombs, function location bombs, construction types, all those type of things. And so, yes, that's exactly what MDO is there to do, is help you catalog consistently in a standardized manner. And so you're governing the cataloging process, and then you can hold things to compliance. So we have what's called active governance, which is when you're creating material, and then there's passive governance. So you can go back and check to see, well, what has been cataloged that's missing bits of data or that is incorrect. Okay. If there's no more questions, we've got another 5 minutes. Oh, okay, another one just popped in. Okay, do you keep those would-be free text item cataloged? What happens if they are once of requirement? That's okay. Okay, I'm of the mindset, catalog everything. And I know if it's being installed in the plant, to me, you catalog it. The M's and the R's, the spare parts and the repairables, obviously that's a no-brainer. You catalog those things. Some of your operating supplies, that can be questionable. But to me, if you've got a process in place through like an MDO tool, catalog it. Even if you're going to use that thing once every 3 years, it doesn't matter. You're capturing information, you're storing it, and now you're enabling your ERP system become effective for you. So I think you definitely should. Okay, another question we have is, how can this help oil and gas industry, specifically energy? How can what help? The stocking strategy. So, well, if you think, I guess you're assuming that you're questioning the stocking strategy. As I mentioned, so some of these heavy industry, oil and gas, mining, have hundreds of millions of dollars of spare parts. As in the introduction, you saw I worked for a very large mining company in Australia, and I was looking after almost $500 million of spare parts. That was, I think we had almost 300,000 SKUs. So that is extremely important to have stocking strategies around how are you managing these materials from a very high level right down to the transactional level. So we had very detailed stocking strategies that were required, which is that's easy because you put a lot of resource at it. Where it's more difficult is in a company that doesn't really hold the value of the spare parts. And that's a shame because it comes back down to data management because they can become very expensive. I was in a chemicals plant that didn't have the same level of focus. So we had 40% of the total cash of that business tied up in spare parts and was completely under-resourced and under-controlled. High percent of free techs. Free techs was 50 to 60%. So people were just buying more and more parts, ended up in squirrel stores, get credited in, high percentage of surplus. So drowning in cost. So again, we can talk about this for days in terms of the impact that you can have, but putting a stocking strategy in place to manage your indirect materials can easily save your company millions and millions of dollars. So if you get a chance, look about, reach out to us. We can help you with a return on your investment type of a exercise to see if it's something that's worth talking to your finance. It's always going to come back down to numbers and value that you can generate for the business. In noise alone, you can save the company a lot. I mentioned in that, one thing I didn't mention was in the mining company, we had a specific effort we had a project for about a year that we focused on free text. I think I mentioned this in the previous webinar, where we reduced one of the mine sites was at over 65% free text. We got them down to under 8, and that single mine site removed $30 million of inventory in 9 months because we forced them to consume the stock they already had instead of free texting it. And the ironic part was, because now we had visibility of that consumption, SAP and our inventory optimization tool told us to stock thousands more materials. And we did, because most of it was low value, low risk, low value materials. So we stocked them because of the remote nature of the plant. So it was a win-win. Not only did the maintenance guys give us the information we needed, well, we stocked more of what they actually wanted. So there you go. I think, let me...
Tim, we also have one question in chat window. So what software we uses for MRP?
What software to use for MRP?
Yes.
Well, any ERP system will have an MRP generation in it. So we don't run MRP in MDO. The ERP system does that. So MDO will feed the information and collect the information that goes into your ERP system so that MRP runs in the ERP. Okay, so MDO, the tool is there to provide a framework and standardization of your master data that goes into your ERP system to control it effectively. So MRP, or Material Requirements Planning, is a program that your ERP system will run. I hope I answered that question as required. Let me see here. Let me just close this box here. And oops, shit, sorry about that. Okay, last slide. So next month, Isha, I don't know if you noticed, I've tentatively set that date for the 21st. I hope that date works for you. That's about a month from now. Yeah. And we'll talk about procurement strategies. So this is another area that it's been near and dear to my heart is purchasing master data. A lot of people don't see that as they're being master data, so they don't treat it that way. Procurement people don't like master data because generally they're category managers, they're negotiators, they're there to reduce the cost of things, but maintaining the data is not really their forte in a lot of examples. And I don't mean that negatively, it's just fact. It's people types. So there's a lot of work you can do, as I mentioned. If you maintain the data, SAP can do the work for you. And we'll explore that in more detail next webinar. So I hope that helps. Please reach out if you have any more questions, and we hope to see you at the next webinar next month.